Introduction. Pakistan is China's Israel. General Xiong Guankai. For decades, Beijing's secretive ties with Islamabad have run closer than most. Formal alliances. Founded on a shared enmity with India, China's backing to Pakistan has gone so deep that it was willing to offer the ultimate gift from one state to another, the materials that Pakistan's nuclear scientists needed to build the bomb. Pakistan acted as China's backdoor during its years of diplomatic isolation, the bridge between Nixon and Mao, and the front line in Beijing's struggles with the Soviet Union during the late stages of the Cold War. Now, Pakistan is a central part of China's transition from a regional power to a global one. The country lies at the heart of Beijing's plans for a network of ports, pipelines, roads, and railways connecting the oil and gas fields of the Middle East to the megacities of East Asia. Its coastline is becoming a crucial staging post for China's takeoff as a naval power, extending its reach from the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. Penetration by Pakistan's intelligence services into the darkest corners of global jihadi networks are a vital asset to China as it navigates its growing interests in the Islamic world, and seeks to choke off support for the militant activities that pose one of the gravest threats to China's internal stability. For Pakistan, China is the best potential ticket out of instability and economic weakness, the greatest hope that a region contemplating a security vacuum after the West's withdrawal from Afghanistan can instead become an integral part of a new Silk Road. China has been Pakistan's diplomatic protector, its chief arms supplier, and its call of last resort when every other supposed friend has left it in the lurch. Virtually every important moment in Pakistan's recent history has been punctuated with visits by its presidents, prime ministers, and army chiefs to Beijing, where the deals and deliberations have so often proved to have a decisive impact on the country's fate. Yet all of this now hangs in the balance. Pakistan is becoming the battleground for China's encounters with Islamic militancy, the country more than any other where China's rise has turned it into a target. As extremists at war with the Pakistani government train their sights on its increasingly powerful sponsor, this is the place where so many of Beijing's plans for the wider region, for its relationship with the Islamic world, for its counter-terrorism strategy, and for the stability of its western periphery could completely unravel. Sino-Pakistani ties have proved remarkably resilient since their early, tentative days. Across the last few decades they have survived China's transition from Maoism to market economy, the rise of Islamic militancy in the region, and the shifting cross-currents of the two countries' relationships with India and the United States. Even developments that might have pulled the two sides apart have often ended up forcing them closer together. India's economic resurgence and the warming of New Delhi's ties with Washington could have tempted Beijing to contemplate a policy of equidistance in South Asia. Instead, China has moved to bolster Pakistan further against the rise of a more potent rival. Concerns over growing unrest in the Muslim-majority province of Xinjiang, in China's far west, might have resulted in deepening tensions over Islamabad's dealings with extremist groups. It has instead led China to depend all the more heavily on Pakistani security forces. And while Chinese concerns about Pakistan's stability have undoubtedly stalled some commercial ventures, they have ultimately resulted in China doubling down on its economic support in order to help keep Pakistan's head above water. At times, the continued vitality of a relationship that could have ended up as a quaint legacy of the 1960s is a puzzle to outside observers. It can seem thin, lacking the sense of cultural affinity or common values that so often help to underpin friendships and alliances. Pakistan looks to the West and to the Islamic world as its reference points, not to the Middle Kingdom. Even the language. All-weather friends, deeper than the deepest ocean, sweeter than honey can sound like protesting too much. And when the question posed is, what does Pakistan actually do for China, the answers that come back are often a little lackluster. Yet traditionally, the strength of the relationship has hinged on the fact that Beijing has rarely needed Pakistan to do anything vastly different from what it intends to do anyway. Just as advocates of deeper ties between Washington and New Delhi have argued that American strategic generosity towards India is an investment in its own geopolitical well-being, to be pursued regardless of any Indian quid pro quo, China's policy sees a strong, capable Pakistan as an asset to China in its own right. Of course China would like to see Islamabad exercising greater caution and predictability in its dealings with India. It wants Pakistan to do a more convincing job of combating Uyghur militancy. It would prefer Pakistan to run a better functioning economy. But none of these concerns obviate the essential fact that an India that is forced to look nervously over its shoulder at its western neighbor is easier for Beijing to manage. The early chapters of this book look at these India-centric foundations for the China-Pakistan relationship. The first chapter deals with three crucial wars. The Sino-Indian War of 1962 made the value of strategic cooperation fully apparent to the Chinese and the Pakistanis and brought a rapid resolution to their own outstanding border dispute. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, in which there was a real prospect of Chinese intervention on Pakistan's behalf, formed the basis of China's status as the all-weather friend in the Pakistani public imagination. The 1971 Indo-Pakistani War, in which Beijing failed to come to Islamabad's aid, ostensibly showed the limits of the relationship. Yet in many ways it set in motion security cooperation of an even more significant nature. China and Pakistan have never been treaty allies, and their armies come from such radically different traditions that the two sides have often talked past each other on matters of strategy. But after Pakistan's devastating defeat, China helped the country to develop a set of military capabilities to ensure that it would never face the same fate again. Central to this was China's backing for Pakistan's nuclear ambitions. The subject of the book's second chapter. Close collaboration on an area of such high sensitivity has built a level of trust between the two militaries that a more conventional security partnership might never have delivered. And although it ensured, as the third chapter shows, that during subsequent crises on the subcontinent China was far more likely to try to defuse the risk of war than to swing in behind the Pakistanis in a confrontation with New Delhi, the fundamental nature of China's support has been unwavering. Even as the Sino-Indian relationship has improved, India's rise as a potential competitor to Beijing has further reinforced the original rationale for its partnership with Pakistan. While the relationship between China and Pakistan could once be seen almost exclusively through a South Asian security framework as a subset of the China-India and India-Pakistan rivalries, there are now a host of factors that transcend it. India still provides the strategic glue that binds the two sides together, but the dilemmas Beijing is wrestling with in Pakistan and Afghanistan are at the crux of a far larger set of issues. The fourth chapter looks at Xinjiang, the restive, Muslim-majority region in China's northwest, and the role that China's struggles with terrorism have played in the Sino-Pakistani relationship. While Pakistan was once the main religious and economic outlet for the Uyghurs, Xinjiang's indigenous Muslim inhabitants, it has now become their principal connection to the world of extremism. The linkages between security threats in China and the rise of extremist forces in Southwest and Central Asia have become the greatest sore point in Sino-Pakistani ties, and even raised anxieties in Beijing about whether Pakistan's Islamization puts the underlying basis of the relationship in doubt. Militancy in Pakistan has also threatened to derail the two sides' plans to add a serious economic dimension to a partnership that has been almost entirely about security. Chinese investments and Chinese workers in Pakistan have become targets for militants trying to stoke tension between Islamabad and Beijing, turning the country into the most dangerous place to be an overseas Chinese worker. Yet, as the fifth chapter argues, when there has been a serious enough strategic imperative for China, the two sides' grand economic projects have been able to overcome seemingly insuperable obstacles. From the Karakoram highway to Gwadar port, political and military factors have continued to provide momentum even when the commercial rationale is absent. The sixth chapter focuses on Afghanistan, where China has struggled to decide whether militancy or the presence of a geostrategic rival poses the greater threat. The period since 9/11 has seen China sit on the sidelines of a war that it wanted neither the Taliban nor the United States to win. Yet as the U.S. withdrawal has loomed ever closer and the terrorist threat from Xinjiang has grown, the balance in the Chinese debate has tipped in favor of the view that stabilizing China's western periphery is the more pressing task, even if it involves cooperating with Washington. Pakistan is the country where China's concerns about the spillover of instability in Afghanistan are greatest, and it is to Pakistan that China looks for a long-term political solution there. The final chapter traces China's evolution from free rider to potential regional stabilizer, and the Obama's administration's often frustrating efforts to find common cause with Beijing, where China's assertiveness in East Asia has resulted in intensifying strategic rivalry with the United States and the discomfort of its neighbors. This is a region where Chinese assertiveness, including leaning on its Pakistani friends, is exactly what Washington has been seeking. For Xi Jinping's new government in Beijing, sitting on the sidelines no longer looks like the most prudent approach. As the epilogue sets out, China hopes to use its financial and economic weight to change the balance of incentives in its western neighborhood, launching a set of vastly ambitious trade and infrastructure initiatives that could be transformative in their impact. Pakistan is said to be the greatest beneficiary, with the West's strategic footprint diminishing. As the war in Afghanistan winds down, China is stepping in with tens of billions of dollars of investments in projects that were once thought to be little more than pipe dreams. While this is partly driven by a sense of strategic and economic opportunity on Beijing's part, it is also motivated by fear. Pakistan's troubles and the threat of looming chaos in the region have reinforced to China how much its interests will be harmed if its only reliable friend is left fragile and faltering. In-depth studies on the China-Pakistan relationship are few and far between, with virtually no full-length treatments appearing since the early 1970s. This is partly because the subject is something of an intellectual orphan, falling between a variety of regions and disciplines, and partly because the obstacles facing analysts in their efforts to find reliable sources and establish basic facts make it that much more tempting to neglect. The Sino-Pakistani relationship encompasses some of the most sensitive areas of the two sides' national security policies. Officials in China and Pakistan are naturally circumspect when discussing it. And this is not just true for foreign researchers. Even the limited number of Chinese and Pakistani analysts who study the relationship are liable to run into roadblocks. One Chinese academic complained that virtually every time he requested a declassified document from the Foreign Ministry archives, they treated his interest as reason enough to classify it again. As a result, much of the contemporary analysis of the China-Pakistan Relationship is mediated through a series of distorting prisms. In India, the circulation of leaks and rumors about nefarious Sino-Pakistani activities is virtually a cottage industry. In Pakistan, political leaders have often been eager to dress up tentative plans between the two sides as firm agreements, and to portray Chinese backing for their position as far stronger than exists in reality. In China, articles on topics such as the nuclear relationship are designed to mislead, not to enlighten. At times it seems that almost any questionable claim can quickly gain traction, be recycled, and take on the status of accepted truth. China's supposed plans for military bases in FATA. Pakistan's supposed intentions to lease China a tenth of its territory. And the purported presence of 11,000 Chinese troops in Pakistan's north are only a few of the most recent on a long list. The mysteries and distorted claims about Sino-Pakistani ties have sometimes made it difficult for outside observers to reach accurate assessments. It would be one thing if every wild story turned out to be a myth, but some of the most outlandish-seeming claims have proved to be entirely accurate. As one nuclear expert writes, China's deal with Pakistan was so dramatic that there was little consensus among U.S. government officials over what ultimate agenda it served. Anyone tempted to downplay all the rumors that emanate from this unusual relationship risks missing developments of transformative importance. This book is the culmination of 6 years of traveling between the different countries that are its main focus: China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and the United States, confirming and disconfirming claims, testing out hypotheses, and assessing the reliability of various sources against real-world events. While it doesn't seek to provide a comprehensive history or anatomy of the relationship, I hope it will help to provide a starting point for thinking through the most important issues at stake. Over the period of research, the relationship has also started to open up. The reflexive protectiveness that had long characterized discussion of the subject, particularly in China, is beginning to ease. A few years back, many of the officials I met with were suspicious of why a foreigner was so interested in talking to them about the relationship. By the time I was finishing my research, almost everything was on the table, from debates in Beijing about whether to launch nuclear strikes on India if Islamabad came under threat, to China's complaints about the Pakistani intelligence services' ties with Uyghur militants. Yet in the study of both Chinese and Pakistani foreign policy, it remains an unusual case. The pathologies of China and Pakistan's most difficult relationships have been exhaustively explored, and do much to shape our understanding of the two countries, but a very different perspective is opened up when we look at how they deal with their friends. A friendship forged by war. We have been let down by the Americans, Ayub said, but they are frightened of Chinese involvement. And that, Mr. President, is now the only card in your hands, said the Information Secretary. Ayub sat up and, putting the book down on the table, said, "Then let us use that card." September 1965. Nixon, could you tell the Chinese it would be very helpful if they could move some forces or threaten to move some forces? Kissinger, absolutely. Nixon, they've got to threaten or they've got to move, one of the two. Nixon, this should have been done long ago. The Chinese have not warned the Indians. Kissinger, oh, yeah. Nixon, all they've got to do is move something. Move a division. You know, move some trucks. Fly some planes. You know, some symbolic act. We're not doing a goddamn thing, Henry, you know that. December 1971. 1971. In Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's suite at the Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue, the mood was bleak. One could see at a glance that it was all up for Pakistan this time, noted one of the Pakistani officials in attendance. Bhutto, recently reappointed as Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, had arrived in New York ready for the diplomatic fight of his nation's life. He knew that the situation in East Pakistan was grim. The Pakistani army had been decimated, would soon run out of fuel in the west, and Indian troops were advancing on Dhaka from all sides. There were fears that India could push on to enforce its territorial claims in Kashmir, leaving only a rump state behind. International sympathy for Islamabad's position was limited. Hundreds of thousands of Bengalis had been killed in the Pakistani military's futile campaign to prevent Bangladesh from gaining its independence, drawing global outrage. And time was running out. On December 9, 1971, the UN Secretary-General received a telegram from Dhaka, conveying a message from General Farman Ali, who led the Pakistani forces in East Pakistan. The command was ready to give up and wanted the UN to arrange the withdrawal. Bhutto, who was barely off the plane, scrambled to get hold of Pakistan's President, Yahya Khan, to find out whether this was the government's position or just freelancing by the general. It was clear that his room for maneuver was rapidly disappearing. Bhutto at least hoped to receive support from two powerful backers, the United States and China. Pakistan was still basking in the glow of appreciation for facilitating the rapprochement between Washington and Beijing. Islamabad's role was notable not only for its success in ensuring the secrecy of communications between the two sides, when any leak could have derailed the whole venture, but its willingness to devote serious attention to the delicate process at the highest levels of government during a time of national crisis. The legendary secret operation that brought Henry Kissinger to China on a Piaget plane, while the world believed him to be recuperating from a stomachache at a Pakistani hill station, had been orchestrated that July. Nixon's own breakthrough visit to China was supposed to take place in a few months' time. Neither man wanted their treatment of Pakistan to damage Chinese perceptions of U.S. reliability. As Kissinger put it, "We cannot turn on Pakistan, and I think it would have disastrous consequences with China that after they gave us an airport we massacre them." Even more importantly, with India supporting the Bengali rebels, and the Soviet Union backing India, Beijing and Washington needed to ensure that Pakistan was not fatally weakened by such a constellation of forces. What they were actually willing to do about it was another matter. Despite President Nixon's avowed policy of tilting towards Pakistan, there was fierce resistance within the U.S. government to putting any such measures into practice. To support a country that many believed was responsible for a near genocidal level of slaughter. Pakistan's attempt to invoke the 1959 bilateral security agreement between the two countries received short shrift. Bhutto had breakfast with Kissinger at the Waldorf Astoria on December 11. Chinese wallpaper and discreet waiters made one nearly forget that 8,000 miles away, the future of my guest's country hung by a thread, he recalled in his memoirs. Kissinger advised Bhutto that Pakistan would not be saved by mock tough rhetoric, a speciality of his breakfast companion. "It is not that we do not want to help you, it is that we want to preserve you. It is all very well to proclaim principles, but finally we have to assure your survival." He urged him to work out a common position with the Chinese. Bhutto replied that the Chinese were confused by the evident schism in the U.S. government. What should they believe? For the United States, the possibility of Beijing intervening militarily was real. Nixon and Kissinger had been talking up the prospect for months as a means of Deterring New Delhi's involvement, Nixon closing his angry meeting in November with the Indian Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, by issuing the warning that it would be impossible to calculate with precision the steps which other great powers might take if India were to initiate hostilities. Kissinger directed the White House and State Department staffs to leave India to its fate if China provoked border incidents. But the Chinese were keeping their counsel. Since November 23, China's ambassador to the UN, Huang Hua, had been conducting secret meetings with Kissinger in CIA safe houses in New York, the principal channel of communications between the two countries at the time. At the initial meeting, Kissinger and Alexander Haig, his military aide, gave a military briefing that suggested, with a wink, that India had left its northern border with China exposed. As the situation for Pakistan worsened, that wink became a set of explicit messages. Nixon told Kissinger that he strongly wanted to encourage Chinese action, but damn it, I am convinced that if the Chinese start moving, the Indians will be petrified. On December 8, he gave his assent for Kissinger to convey a note to Zhou Enlai stating, if you are ever going to move, this is the time. 2 days later, another meeting took place in the New York safe house. Kissinger told the Chinese officials that the United States would be moving ships into the vicinity and allowing Jordan, Iran, Saudi Arabia and Turkey to send American arms to the Pakistanis. But the purpose of the session was laid out starkly. When I asked for this meeting, I did so to suggest Chinese military help to Pakistan, to be quite honest. When Ambassador Huang sent word on December 12 that he needed to see Kissinger again urgently, which was the first time the Chinese had solicited a meeting, it seemed a fateful moment. We assumed that only a matter of gravity could induce them into such a departure. We guessed that they were coming to the military assistance of Pakistan. They're going to move, he told Nixon. No question, they're going to move. The two men discussed the possibility of a Soviet response to any Chinese action, and Nixon took the dramatic decision that in those circumstances the United States would provide China with military backing. He had already ordered an aircraft carrier task force to head as far as the Straits of Malacca. Now it was sent into the Bay of Bengal to give effect to our strategy and to reinforce the message to Moscow, which duly responded by sending a nuclear-armed submarine to tail the task force. Nixon's move was a signal to China too, one that brought with it the risk of an all-out superpower war. Nixon made his first use of the hotline to Moscow in a message that concluded, I cannot emphasize too strongly that time is of the essence to avoid consequences neither of us want. Kissinger helpfully noted that if the Soviet Union decided to wipe out China, then the president's upcoming visit there would be pointless. The Pakistanis were also, at least ostensibly, trying to discern Beijing's intentions. Following the bleak news about the situation in Dhaka, the Chinese Deputy Foreign Minister had called on Bhutto at Pakistan's mission to the UN, where he urged very strongly that Pakistani forces hold out for another week, claiming that there could be great benefits. Iqbal Akhund, a senior Pakistani diplomat, relates. In a delegation meeting in the minister's hotel room next morning, the question on everyone's mind was, will the Chinese? Won't the Chinese? Bhutto's chaperone, the colonel, said that a massive Chinese intervention was needed without a moment's notice. Bhutto asked opinions about what, if anything, China was likely to do. He must have known the answer quite well and was probably testing the diplomatic acumen of the delegates. Each delegate answered the question in his lights and hopes. In fact, he knew the answer perfectly well. Bhutto had been sent to Beijing in November to request Chinese support. There were plenty of signs that something was amiss. China allowed a rare public demonstration during the visit, and he was taken to see the underground shelters the Chinese had built for protection from Soviet attack, as if to signal its own security fears. The trip itself was only taking place following China's decision to decline Yahya Khan's request for a morale-boosting visit from a senior Chinese leader to Pakistan. Bhutto's mission was the second of its sort that year. A delegation headed by Foreign Secretary Sultan Khan and Lt. Gen. Gul Hassan Khan had visited in April. Both drew blanks. China never, during these or subsequent talks, held out any possibility of coming to Pakistan's aid with her armed forces, Sultan Khan later noted. In the November talks there was never any question of active Chinese military involvement, and such an eventuality was not even discussed. This was not the message that Bhutto conveyed to the Pakistani public. On returning to Pakistan, he claimed that his visit had been a complete success and that the results were tangible and concrete. After meeting Bhutto, Yahya Khan announced that in the event of an Indian attack the Chinese would intervene and help Pakistan as much as they could. Yahya Khan had made similar statements even before the Bhutto trip. It was bluff, and the Indians were not falling for it. India had been aware of the Chinese position throughout. In January, Indian intelligence had assessed that Beijing was unlikely to fight for Pakistan but would adopt a threatening posture on the Sino-Indian border and even stage some border incidents and clashes. But by June, they had obtained a detailed readout of the Pakistanis' April visit to Beijing. More importantly, they concluded that China had not undertaken the necessary build-up of forces and supplies for a military intervention. India demonstrated its confidence with the decision to move 3 of the 6 divisions assigned to the Chinese border in the eastern and western Himalayas to the East Pakistani front. India's position was reinforced by the August agreement with the Soviet Union, the Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty, which implied the strong threat of a response from Moscow to any Chinese military action. Privately, the Soviets had pledged that they would open diversionary action if China tried to involve itself. The possibility of China's intervention still informed the timing of the war. Prosecuting it in winter would make it harder for Chinese troops to cross the snow-covered passes on the border. But by the time India was drawing up its contingency plans, it had already concluded that Beijing would be unwilling and unready to act. Although it is omitted from Kissinger's own dramatic recounting of the events, U.S. intelligence assessments had reached the same conclusion. In New York, Bhutto responded angrily to General Farman Ali's surrender message. In a telegram to Yahya Khan, he insisted that we must fight to the bitter end, otherwise we will suffer final disgrace, be rendered friendless and ultimately finished. The Chinese must intervene physically and immediately. The next day, Yahya Khan would ask China to do exactly this, telling the Chinese ambassador that he would rather the Chinese than the Russians took over East Pakistan. On December 12, the answer came back from Beijing, reinforcing what both Yahya Khan and Bhutto must already have known: China would continue to support Pakistan morally, economically, and politically, but its capability to intervene was limited, and please do not pin much hope on it. This did not stop General Headquarters in Rawalpindi from sending one last, desperate message to officers in the East on December 13, telling them to hold out because support was on its way, yellow from the north and white from the south. It was soon clear to the temporarily hardened troops that neither the Chinese nor the Americans were in fact riding to the rescue, though at one They believed that a contingent of Indian commandos was the Chinese coming to save them. Pakistan's final surrender would come 4 days later. If there had been any thought to step in on China's part, the timing could not have been worse. The Chinese military was in state of turmoil. Mao had removed virtually the entire high command following Lin Biao's fatal flight in September. China's military chief and Mao's chosen successor had died in highly suspicious circumstances, his plane crashing over the Mongolian desert as he fled the country after what Mao claimed was a coup attempt. Over 1,000 senior Chinese military officials were purged, the Air Force was grounded, the PLA itself was in disgrace, and Beijing was gripped by a sense of political crisis. In the meantime, China still had to sustain its military support to the North Vietnamese, and was seriously concerned about the risks of a major clash with the Soviet Union. Following the Sino-Soviet border altercations in 1969, in which a series of low-level conflicts over disputed territory threatened the prospect of full-scale war, the Soviets had moved 45 divisions to China's northern border. Bhutto himself was a witness to a massive Chinese civil defense program put in place to prepare for the possibility of nuclear strikes. But it was not military disarray or fear of war with the Russians that was decisive. Nor was it simply the snowy passes. If they had wanted to, the Chinese could have made the necessary preparations, at least to make threatening gestures on the Sikkim and Kashmir fronts, as they belatedly hinted they might do in December 1971. Rather, it was a political judgment that would foreshadow many other crucial episodes in the relationship between the two countries over the decades to come. China would not pull Pakistan out of the holes it insisted on digging for itself. It was clear to virtually every Pakistani visitor who passed through Beijing how uncomfortable China was with the crackdown in East Pakistan. Zhou Enlai, in his meetings with the Pakistani delegation in April, made several pointed suggestions about the handling of the situation, advice that came after great deliberation and consultations with Chairman Mao. Participation by the army is only the first step, and the major problem of winning the hearts of the people through economic and political measures should be tackled quickly, he advised. He would later state in public that China did not provide arms to a country to be used against its own people. The fact that pro-Chinese political factions were a target didn't help either. Of even greater concern was the fact that Beijing saw a Pakistani strategy that was heading for defeat on all fronts. Voiding public support in East Pakistan, shredding international sympathy, and creating a pretext for Indian intervention. Zhou stressed the need for a speedy solution that would take into account the wishes of the majority of the people in East Pakistan, but he didn't see one coming. Neither did China see a viable military solution once India was engaged. The Chinese military attaché, on a visit to the Pakistani Army's general headquarters in Rawalpindi, saw the map showing Pakistani and Indian positions in the first week, and remarked that the fighting on the Western Front was more or less over. By the time Zhou Enlai delivered his strident speech against India after the fall of Dhaka, Indian diplomats were comfortable enough to dismiss it as impotent rage. Chinese support to Pakistan did have its value. While at times Beijing moved slowly with some of Islamabad's emergency requests, it maintained its economic and military aid throughout the year. This included a large shipment of arms to the Pakistani Army in East Pakistan, the training and equipping of 2 additional divisions, and a further $100 million of assistance. It scrapped at the UN Security Council on Pakistan's behalf and, in the aftermath of the war, vetoed Bangladesh's application for UN membership until the withdrawal of Indian Troops had been confirmed and Pakistani POWs had been returned, despite the reputational costs. China's public expressions of support were valued at a time when these were thin on the ground, and provided some cover for Pakistani leaders to pretend that private reassurances went further. But it fell well short of what many in Pakistan had hoped for and, in some cases, even expected. As the end of the war grew ever nearer, a Chinese intervention looked more and more like Pakistan's only possible escape route from self-inflicted disaster. But ultimately Pakistan would lose half its population, a fifth of its territory, and c. 93,000 of its soldiers become prisoners of war without even a token skirmish on the Sino-Indian border. China's role in the 1971 war captures much about the relationship, the oscillation between hope, self-deception, public exaggeration, and resigned realism on Pakistan's part, and on China's, a blend of tempered support, gentle scolding and steely pragmatism. The Washington-Beijing liaisons have since become a feature of almost every Pakistani crisis. It is not difficult to trace a line straight through to Sino-Pakistani-US relations around the Kargil crisis or the aftermath of the Bin Laden killing, Bhutto's disappointing visit to China in November 1971 would be mirrored by Nawaz Sharif in June 1999 and Yousef Gilani in May 2011, episodes that will be dealt with in later chapters. Over the decades to come, China would become Pakistan's only reliable diplomatic, economic and military backer. But would it be there for Pakistan in its hour of need? The answer in 1971, and ever since, has been, only up to a point. As a Dawn editorial in February 1972 put it, had we not presumed that we would get unlimited Chinese support, regardless of our objectives and conduct, the country might have been saved from humiliation and defeat. The People's Republic of China has been a great friend of Pakistan. Let us honor this friendship by being rational and realistic and by not imposing unnecessary burdens and strains on the friendship. Objective reality must be measured by its own size and not by the length of its shadow. 1965. The seeds of the Pakistanis' misplaced hopes had been sown 6 years earlier. The Indo-Pakistani War in September 1965 did not involve a great deal more Chinese military activity than in 1971, and the war itself was a disaster for Pakistan, from the first failed attempts by Pakistani troops to precipitate an insurgency in Kashmir to the appearance of Indian artillery within range of Lahore International Airport. But the effect of China's stance during the conflict on public opinion in Pakistan was profound. As one strong account of China's role puts it, of all of Pakistan's supporters, China spoke the loudest. She gave Pakistan unqualified moral support and, at the same time, threatened India with grave consequences. By linking the Sino-Indian and the Indo-Pakistan conflicts, the Chinese fostered a sense of urgency among the powers about terminating the Indo-Pakistan War. It inhibited some of the great powers from siding openly with India and from putting as much pressure upon Pakistan as they might otherwise have been inclined to do, and it contributed to bringing about ceasefire on terms acceptable to Pakistan. When Liu Shaoqi, the Chinese Prime Minister, arrived on a visit to Lahore in February 1966, he was carried in the arms of cheering crowds, prompting the U.S. Consul General to lament that Pakistan is lost. China's crushing victory in its own war with India in 1962 was itself one of the sources of Pakistan's overconfidence, leading Rawalpindi to underestimate the capabilities of the Indian armed forces when it launched its ill-conceived venture in Kashmir. The prospect of Chinese involvement was also part of Bhutto's pro-war case to Ayub Khan. Indian troops in Assam would be forced to fight on two fronts if, as Bhutto also mistakenly believed, India moved against East Pakistan and China entered the war. Aziz Ahmed, Ayub Khan's foreign policy advisor, also argued that the most powerful factor in Pakistan's favor was its growing friendship with China, which would stop India from invading Pakistan even if it was driven out of Kashmir. In practice, most of the great powers did not believe that Beijing was willing to embark on an all-out war with India again in 1965, but it gave serious signals that a military intervention might be in the offing. China had the requisite manpower positioned, and CIA analysts believed that its deployments were adequate for small-scale frontier clashes, which would cause the Indians great consternation and divert Indian effort and supplies away from fighting with the Pakistanis. China's foreign minister, Chen Yi, flew into Karachi in the first days of the war and announced that Beijing backed Pakistan's just action. The Chinese government and media kept up a drumbeat of denunciations of India's naked aggression, and steadily escalated its claims of Indian intrusions into its own territory. This culminated in a threat that if the Indian government did not dismantle all its military works for aggression on the Chinese side of the China-Sikkim boundary or on the boundary itself within 3 days, it would be responsible for all the grave consequences of its inaction. The statement prompted the Indian diplomat in Beijing who had received the note to ask the perhaps superfluous question, is this an ultimatum? The answer, yes. It was published in full in the People's Daily, the Chinese Communist Party's official newspaper, on September 17. Although China had resisted Pakistan's requests to make military preparations earlier in 1965, not believing that war with India was likely, it finally stepped up its mobilization on the Sikkim-Tibet border and in Ladakh, the two locations that Mao had decided should be readied for possible intervention. Liu Shaoqi sent a letter to Ayub Khan assuring Pakistan that it would respond to an Indian attack. China also reached a set of agreements with Indonesia and Pakistan about the joint supply of military equipment, much of which was to be airlifted from Hotan. Detailed planning meetings were undertaken with the Pakistani Army and Air Force over their needs for tanks, recoilless guns, shells, and aircraft. But cooperation on logistics was more straightforward than on strategy. On 19 September, during the crucial period after the Chinese ultimatum, Ayub Khan embarked on a secret mission to Beijing with Bhutto, which nearly proved fatal. An Indian air attack struck the airfield just as they were about to take off. Ayub Khan was seeking support, equipment, and clarity on what a Chinese response would actually amount to. He was thrown by the answer he received. China would maintain pressure on India for as long as necessary, he was told. But he was encouraged by Zhou Enlai and Chen Yi to mount guerrilla attacks on India even if 1 or 2 major cities were lost. You must keep fighting, they insisted, even if you have to withdraw to the hills. A stunned Ayub Khan replied, Mr. Prime Minister, I think you are being rash. He returned from Beijing tired and depressed and decided to put the China card back in the deck. The Pakistani leadership had no intention of prolonging the conflict in those circumstances and soon signed a ceasefire agreement. As one Pakistani diplomat described it, Pakistan fought in the British tradition short duration wars that come to a head, then a ceasefire. The Chinese experience of warfare was very different, extended conflict over the length and breadth of the country. Even if they had stood by us, there were two very different conceptions of what that meant. Mao had decided that China would intervene under two conditions: that India attacked East Pakistan, and that Pakistan requested Chinese intervention. In the end, neither of them obtained. Despite the disagreements, China's support left a significant impression on the Pakistani public, especially by comparison with the United States, which responded to the war by cutting off aid and military supplies. While Pakistan's president only gave measured thanks to China in his public statements, students in Karachi paraded with banners of Zhou and Chen and called on the Chinese ambassador to convey their appreciation. A huge crowd burned down the U.S. information library. Bitterness toward the U.S. is deep-seated, noted a State Department research memorandum. The 1965 war had a catalytic effect on the Sino-Pakistani relationship. From that point on, with U.S. military aid suspended, China became Pakistan's primary arms supplier, a position it has relinquished only for brief periods ever since. China also established itself as the populist cause, a true friend of Pakistan's by contrast to the untrustworthy Americans. Whatever the actual level of material support either side was providing, it was also the year that Pakistani officials claimed to have started negotiations with China for the technology and materials necessary to build a nuclear bomb, barely a year after China's own first test. Although Pakistan's efforts to improve relations with Moscow and Washington in the aftermath of the war would lead to a temporary cooling in political ties with Beijing, the tone and pattern of cooperation between the two sides was now set. 1962. The path to the all-weather friendship had been a tortuous one. Although Pakistan has the distinction of being one of the first states to recognize the People's Republic of China and the first Muslim one, it would be more than a decade before the relationship began in earnest. When the first Pakistani ambassador, Major General Nawabzada Agha Mohammad Rasa, presented his credentials to Mao in 1951, he was coolly received. I have great pleasure in receiving the letter of credentials of the King of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, presented by you. There was no mention of the fact that the ambassador was representing Pakistan, a successor of his Indian counterpart noted gleefully in a speech to the U.S. Congress. At the time, there was little doubt that Beijing tilted in India's direction. Pakistan was a country run by feudal landlords, industrialists, and the military. It would formally ally itself with the United States by joining the region's two Western treaty organizations, SEATO in 1954 and CENTO in 1955, and signing a bilateral cooperation agreement with Washington in 1959, resulting in substantial American aid and military supplies. SEATO in particular was conceived with the clear intent of containing China, and Pakistan quickly agreed to the establishment of an NSA listening post at Badabar, near Peshawar, to spy on Chinese and Soviet communications. Beijing's bedfellow in the early 1950s was India, its anti-colonial, non-aligned neighbor across the Himalayas that had inherited most of the socialists during partition, among the other spoils, and would ultimately end up in close security cooperation with the Soviet Union. The Sino-Soviet split was one of several factors that eventually prized the relationship apart, but the 1950s, at least for a few years, represented the high point of Hindi Chini bye-bye, the Hindi phrase used at the time meaning Indians and Chinese are brothers. It was India, not Pakistan, that consistently supported Beijing's assumption of the Chinese seat at the United Nations in Taipei's place. While India played a key role in helping to squash Tibetan appeals at the UN after Chinese troops invaded in 1950, Pakistan was providing transit facilities for U.S. aircraft to supply the Tibetan rebels. The 5 principles of peaceful coexistence mentioned in the preamble to the agreement reached by China and India in 1954 formed the basis of the non-aligned movement's own principles in subsequent years, and would assume a central role in Chinese foreign policy over the decades to come. China's dealings with India would, however, prove to be one of the cases to which the five principles mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit and peaceful coexistence least applied. While the border dispute between India and China ultimately brought them to war in 1962, in the 1950s it was Pakistan that had territorial issues with China. Beijing laid claim to 3,400 square miles of Pakistani territory in Kashmir, encompassing tracts of the old Principality of Hunza, whose rulers, the Mirs, had traditionally recognized Chinese suzerainty. When the British seized control of the kingdom in 1891, the Mir fled to China. During partition, the Kuomintang, China's ruling party at the time, conducted secret negotiations over restoring Hunza's status as an independent state under Chinese fealty, before the Mir finally decided to accede to Pakistan. Sporadic Chinese border violations around Hunza were being reported from 1953, and in 1959 Ayub Khan announced that any Chinese intrusions into Pakistani territory would be repelled by Pakistan with all the force at her command. In September 1959, the Pakistani government received a Chinese map showing a line of territorial claims running from the Mintaka Pass down to Shimshul Pass and eastward. In October, following Sino-Indian clashes, Ayub proposed a joint defense union with India, stating that I can see quite clearly the inexorable push of the North in the direction of the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. Both Pakistan and China had mostly been careful, however, not to antagonize each other. China refrained from denouncing Pakistan's membership of the Western treaty organizations, saving its verbal firepower for the United States, and when the country's two prime ministers met on the sidelines of the Asian-African Bandung Conference, Muhammad Ali Bagra assured Zhou Enlai that the military agreements did not reflect any Pakistani hostility towards China. India, he explained, was still the focus. Even Ayub Khan's Joint Defense Union proposal, which was summarily rejected by New Delhi, prompted little more than a raised eyebrow from Beijing, a letter faux innocently asking against whom the joint defense was proposed. 1959 instead proved to be one of the pivotal years in the unraveling of the Sino-Indian relationship. In many ways, the road to the Sino-Pakistani all-weather friendship runs through Lhasa. The 1959 uprising there, the Chinese military's subsequent crackdown, and the Dalai Lama's 15-day journey on foot across the Himalayas to find asylum in India redounded significantly to Pakistan's benefit. Nehru's attempts to tread the line between accepting Chinese sovereignty and supporting Tibetan autonomy no longer cut any ice in Beijing, which was paranoid about India's supposed designs to establish Tibet as a buffer. China's perception that India had supported the uprising and cooperated with the CIA to arm the rebellion eventually led Mao to believe that forceful blows needed to be struck. It was the intersection of the Tibet issue with the two sides' border dispute that resulted in outright war. 2 years earlier, as part of its campaign to establish full control over Tibet, China had completed the 750-mile Aksai-Chin section of the Western Military Road that linked Xinjiang with Lhasa. The road crossed a flat plateau and was serviceable in winter, whereas direct routes from the center of China into Tibet suffered from hazardous terrain and climatic conditions, as well as insurgent attacks from Tibetan tribes. India belatedly discovered the road in 1958 and claimed that 112 miles ran through Indian territory. Border talks accelerated in the aftermath, culminating in In Lay's proposal for a comprehensive settlement in April 1960, an East-West territorial swap, in which Chinese control over Aksai Chin and Indian control over the southern slope of the eastern Himalayas would be acknowledged. Nehru rejected the proposal. His forward policy, adopted in November 1961, instead saw a steady increase in altercations and tension, as the two sides' troops went nose to nose. Mao concluded that negotiations, restraint, or a period of armed coexistence would not stop India from its policy of using military force to challenge Chinese control of disputed territory. He authorized the PLA chief of staff to conduct a fierce and painful attack on the far weaker Indian forces. In a multi-stage series of offensives in October and November 1962, China overran Indian positions and routed its defenses in the east, before calling a unilateral ceasefire and withdrawing troops. It was a devastating defeat for India and for Nehru himself, who was physically and mentally broken by the experience. His daughter, Indira Gandhi, personally blamed Zhou Enlai for having hastened his death. The 1962 war hangs over most of the subsequent developments in the region. The ambivalent Soviet stance over the Sino-Indian border dispute it professed a position of neutrality, and only deviated from that stance briefly because of its need to keep the Chinese on board during the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the last straws in the Sino-Soviet split. Within a few years, Pakistan's good offices would help bring about the Sino-American rapprochement and a virtual alliance against Moscow for the remaining years of the Cold War. India's comprehensive defeat in 1962 shifted the consensus in the country towards the acquisition of nuclear weapons, and led to Pakistan's subsequent decision to follow suit with China's help. 1962 also helped to plant the idea of the two-front war in the minds of policymakers in the three capitals. At one juncture, the Pakistani government suggested to the U.S. Embassy in Karachi that Pakistan's neutrality could be ensured by Indian concessions in Kashmir, implying the possibility of a military intervention if they were not forthcoming. The nightmare of a combined attack by Pakistan and China, with the possibility of defeat, collapse, and even anarchy in India was much on my mind, noted J.K. Galbraith, then U.S. ambassador in New Delhi, who worried about Pakistan forming some kind of axis with Peking. It was on Ayub Khan's mind too, however briefly. Qudratullah Shahab, a writer and senior Pakistani official, was approached by a Chinese student who suggested that he should persuade Ayub Khan to exploit the situation by moving the Pakistani army forward in Kashmir. Shahab, unsure if this might be some message from Beijing, woke the president at 3 a.m. to tell him. Ayub Khan told Shahab to go home and go to bed. Ayub had also been asked by the United States if Pakistan might make a gesture of assurance to Nehru, thereby enabling India to move troops towards the Eastern Front with China. He would do no such thing, and as U.S. military assistance to India grew, he became increasingly disquieted by Washington's redefining the purpose of their regional pacts. If the United States was going to arm non-allied India, then the value of the alliance was inevitably frayed and the grounds for holding back from Beijing's offers of friendship looked tenuous. Indeed, the lack of coordination with China in the circumstances was an active problem for Pakistan. Not only had the war brought about an increase in Western backing for the Indians, but with India facing crushing defeat, Beijing had pulled back rather than taking advantage of the situation to press for a border settlement that could have included Kashmir. Pakistan's president lamented, "I wish the Chinese had consulted us before they ordered the ceasefire, and in future, too, I hope that Before they take any precipitate steps they will consult us, as we may be able to give them sound advice. Ayub Khan moved carefully but decisively. As his biographer notes, the Americans and the British knew that by temperament, tradition and discipline, Ayub would not go too far with the Chinese, but he might go far enough to upset the balance of power in the region. The man who became the head of the China camp in Pakistan's internal debates was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Then in his early days as Pakistan's youngest cabinet minister, he saw the simmering Sino-Indian conflict as an opportunity. The dispute was a chance to strengthen Pakistan's own hand on Kashmir, and Bhutto urged Ayub Khan to take back his inopportune statement that the Sino-Indian territorial dispute was simply India's problem and instead send a signal to Beijing by questioning the very basis of India's stand. He sent a signal of his own in 1960 when he used his discretionary powers as head of Pakistan's delegation to the UN to abstain on Beijing's membership of the body rather than voting against it. Following US complaints, Bhutto's discretion was revoked by a foreign minister still keen to adhere closely to Washington, but the tide was turning in favor of those who favored a new tilt in Pakistani foreign policy. China's path to war with India did indeed provide a significant opening for Pakistan, with the negotiations on the Sino-Pakistani border dispute dovetailing uncannily closely with the conflict. China had initially resisted Pakistan's offer of talks but then moved with tremendous speed, starting 10 days before the outbreak of war and concluding shortly afterwards. China's reply to the Pakistani offer, which stated its willingness to sign a provisional boundary agreement, came 2 days before its first démarche to India over its forward policy in February 1962. The agreement had been negotiated on the Pakistani side by Bhutto's predecessor as foreign minister, Manzoor Qadir, under the close supervision of Ayub Khan, but it was Bhutto who arrived in Beijing in March 1963 to sign the agreement with his Chinese counterpart, Chen Yi, and win much of the acclaim. The settlement announced was on terms clearly favorable to Pakistan. China would transfer 1,942 square kilometers that it controlled to Pakistan. Although its nominal concessions were substantial, Pakistan transferred none of the territory under its control, and the final demarcation, which included 6 of 7 contested passes, accorded closely with the line of actual control that it advocated. Pakistan was not the only beneficiary of Chinese efforts at the time. Afghanistan also saw a relatively generous agreement put in motion that same year, but the China-Pakistan Accord was of genuine strategic importance. It infuriated India, which still claimed much of the territory in question, several thousand square kilometers of which had now been assigned to China. Notionally it was still a provisional agreement that could be reopened in the event of a broader set of talks on Kashmir. In reality, it would entrench Chinese and Pakistani control over northern Kashmir, providing the basis for a mammoth set of infrastructure projects between the two sides which continue to this day. The 3 wars that frame this chapter were the last ones in which Galbraith's nightmare of an attack on India from 2 fronts was realistically contemplated. The nuclearization of the subcontinent fundamentally changed China's handling of subsequent Indo-Pakistani confrontations, and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's successors were to receive an even cooler reception when they flew to Beijing during periods of conflict to solicit Chinese support. China's leaders no longer counseled their Pakistani counterparts to prepare to wage guerrilla warfare from the hills. Instead, after 1971, the most serious military cooperation took place away from the spotlight of war. In reality, China's greatest contribution to Pakistan's security has never really been the prospect of an intervention on its behalf. Beijing gave Pakistan something far more important than that, the ultimate means of self-defense.